Noon and live from my basement. It's the Illinoize Livestream and podcast on a Wednesday. I'm Patrick Pfingsten, Illinoize.com. Fun show for you today. We're going to talk to kind of both sides of the aisle and maybe get their perspectives on how they can fix maybe some of the weaknesses they have in the state, and how maybe we can start to see some progress, either in terms of bipartisanship or maybe starting to fix some of our frustrating parts of our politics today. So he's a Republican strategy data into the results of the 2022 election, and he'll kind of give us a little idea as to why exactly Republicans lost and what should have been a red wave year, and what that means for the GOP moving forward. And we'll talk a little bit about the Democratic side as we welcome former Congressman, former Adjutant General of the Illinois Army National Guard. He's on News Nation all the time and hosts a podcast, Reflections on the River, former Congressman Bill Enyart, to talk a little bit about the Democrats. Congressman, first of all, thanks for joining us. I do appreciate you taking some time. Let's start here. The plight of the Southern Illinois Democrat. The days of the John Bradleys and Brandon Phelps and your predecessor in the House, Jerry Costello, the Democrats seem to have been seemingly wiped away in places in Southern Illinois. As you've seen that trend over the last few years, what do you make of it and why?
Well, thanks for having me today, Patrick. It's great to be with you, and I want you to know I'm a subscriber to your newsletter and read it faithfully, and you really have a great perspective on Illinois politics. And that was a paid not a paid advertisement for you.
Checks in the mail, man.
All right, buddy. Thanks for mentioning my podcast, Reflections from the River. Patrick, it's an interesting situation. The heyday of federal money and state money flowing into Southern Illinois really it goes back, to the days of Paul Powell and Kenny Gray and some of those other great moderate Democrats who so well represented large swaths of Illinois, but large swaths of Southern Illinois. Really what we see here is, in essence, the same thing that's taken place nationwide, and that is you have a division between the urban Democrats and the rural focus going to the Republicans, and those boil down really, I think, more to the social issues, if you will, the question on abortion, the question on guns, question on those types of social issues that are so have become such socially divided issues. A suburban soccer mom doesn't like guns by and large. I mean, they are not a pro-gun constituency. You get your Southern Illinois farmers and hunters, and I've been duck hunting and goose hunting and my entire life, and so you've got that different perspective on those kind of issues, and I think the Republicans have done a much better job of messaging than the Democrats. The Democrats tend to over-intellectualize issues, I think, or at least the Washington, D.C. Democrats do. As you point out, all those moderate folks who John Bradley and Brandon Phelps, who did so much for Southern Illinois, just got wiped out. They got wiped out with Donald Trump. I think Jerry Costello probably retired from Congress because he saw it coming, particularly when they added in Jefferson County to his district, and which then I served for a couple of years. I think what the Democrats need to do would be, when you get outside of Metro East, there's not much. And in fact, as you pointed out, LaToya Greenwood no longer even represents East St. Louis. That's now represented by a Republican from Millstadt. Well, I think that may have been a one-off. I don't know that he'll be able to hold that seat. But I think the best place for Democrats to start in southern Illinois would be Jackson County with Carbondale, and where you've got the university and the student base, and you've got a little more, a little closer to an urban type value population. And if they can wrest a state rep seat or a Senate seat there, and you're going to have to build a bench. When you look at these counties, these rural counties throughout southern Illinois, the Democrats, by and large, have been wiped out. We've lost sheriffs and circuit clerks, and you look at Randolph County, where Barb Brown was a power forever, and those counties now are just completely dominated by Republicans. So you got to start by building the bench.
What do you make of how the polarization of our politics has played into this? Because I've said before, and we can probably do a deep dive on this sometime, but I've said before that Donald Trump is more of an effect than a cause of where we are. That you can point it back to Newt Gingrich and the fights about the Clintons and the attacks on George W. Bush, and then obviously there was the at times very racial anger about Barack Obama. I mean, the polarization in our politics isn't new, but it's worse than ever. But it seems, and I think you can say the same thing about Republicans in the city or parts of the suburbs, that they are just written off because they are, whether it's on a national stage, whether it's the Obama, the Pelosi, now you've got the AOCs, whoever else is. I mean, now Joe Biden's being treated like the boogeyman, who was Uncle Joe for all those years. So, what role do you think the polarization has done, and how much worse has it made it since you served in Congress, a decade ago?
Well, Patrick, I think you're right. I see Trump more as a symptom of the disease than a cause of the disease. He's a masterful showman, and he certainly knows how to appeal to his base. But his base has never really been more than about 35%. So he has done a great job of articulating grievances, some of them legitimate, but some of them vastly overblown by his constituency. It's kind of interesting. AOC and the squad have kind of dropped out of the public view. They were the bogeymen when I ran for Congress. Nancy Pelosi, of course, was the bogeyman. But then it became AOC.
Well, I mean, and in 2012, I was working that campaign just to the north of you in the 13th, and I partially made Nancy Pelosi the boogeyman. I mean, I get it. I mean, it worked. So, sure. But so there's always a bad guy, right? I mean, that's part of it, but it seems more that it's that someone that disagrees with you instead of that someone disagrees with you.
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy the way that it's gone. I know you worked with Rodney Davis, and Rodney and I got along fine on a personal level, and we could chat, and we were always on that same American Airlines flight out of St. Louis, the commuter flight into Washington, D.C. And because we represented really kind of similar districts in that, they were downstate Illinois districts, largely rural, we had a lot in common. And so our constituency had a lot in common. But I used to say, prior to January 6th, I always said, well, things really aren't all that bad. I lived through the 60s. I was in college in the 60s and the 70s. And, I saw the draft riots and the racial tension. And, we had all the assassinations then, the Kennedys and Martin Luther King and all of those sorts of things. And we've not really had a major political figure assassinated here. We've certainly had some attempts on congressmen's lives and on Nancy Pelosi's husband's life. But I never felt like the violence was really at the stage, where they were talking revolution in the 60s. But January 6th kind of changed that for me. And the fact that there were so many people who were willing to take up arms against police and against the very symbols of our government, the very symbols of our democracy. It's fine to demonstrate, and it's fine to carry a placard and shout, but it's another thing when you start macing and spraying police officers and attacking them. That's just unacceptable. So that level of violence certainly accelerated, and I think you can count off the causes. Cable news, people get so involved in their own ecosystems that they don't. There's no room to listen to other people. I see that in my family. I mean, I have cousins who are diehard Trump supporters, and I have cousins who are solid Democrats. And the two don't. Neither side speaks to the other except to scream occasionally. So it's we have to be able to understand that this isn't a civil war. We're not going to be killing each other. And we have to recognize this country was founded 250 years ago with some real division. Slavery among them that would cause some real frictions and eventually cause a civil war. And truthfully, we're still dealing with the echoes of those problems.
As you watched the speakers battle play out a few weeks ago now, I'm sure you met McCarthy, dealt with him a little bit in your term in Congress. Even though it wasn't at the height that he is now, you see, and obviously Mary Miller played a role in this, who's from downstate Illinois, and I, of course, worked to campaign against her in 2020. It was really baffling to see, the GOP kind of, cannibalize itself. From the other side of the street, how did you watch all that play out?
Well, it's really kind of fascinating to watch. Will Rogers always said, "I don't belong to an organized political party. I'm a Democrat." Today, that same, you always with Ronald Reagan and the Bushes, the crew that followed, you always had the, we're going to hang together, we're going to stick together. Once the primaries are over, boy, we're going to reform. And you don't see that today. You have that very hard right element, the Miller among them, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, and some of the other folks who belong to that element, and they simply don't care about policy or about the policies that most folks care about. They'd rather be just completely out of the mix than change their positions, or so it seems. That's at least their public persona. I think Kevin McCarthy gave up way too much to get elected speaker. You have to maintain a position of strength in order to be the leader. And while Nancy Pelosi really didn't have much more of a margin than McCarthy does, she certainly managed to get a whole lot of legislation passed in the last 2 years. And I don't see McCarthy having that kind of influence.
Before we let you go, Congressman, the title you actually probably prefer is General, since you served in both the Army and the National Guard. You've been watching the Ukraine situation closely. There's seemingly a bit of pushback domestically on what we should be doing to arm the Ukrainians. Obviously, there are no boots on the ground. They're not a part of NATO. Where does that conflict stand at this point? What should we be doing? And maybe quite simply, because it seems like a far off fight that doesn't matter to a lot of people as they sit here and try and figure out their own lives. Why should we care?
Well, every good military leader is a bit of a historian. You have to be. You study the campaigns the past to see where the mistakes were made and help guide you in formulating your plans. Putin is not going to be satisfied until he reestablishes the Russian Empire, the old Soviet Union, if you will. He won't be satisfied until he has Ukraine, and after he's got Ukraine, he's going to want the Baltics and so on. If you look back to the 30s, it's Adolf Hitler all over again. I'm going to take this piece, and then I'm going to take that piece, and Putin is no different. We need to stop this now before it goes any further. You know, had the Brits and the French stood up to, and the U.S. stood up to Hitler in 1936 or 1937 or 1938, World War II may not have happened. So we need to stand up to Putin now before he reconstitutes the Russian Empire. In terms of arming Ukraine, I think that we have really done a pretty doggone good job. You know, I mean, the administration gets beaten up. Oh, you're not doing it too fast. Oh, you're giving them too much. But the truth of the matter is, the Russian army was 5 times the size of Ukraine's. The Russian Air Force was 10 times the size of Ukraine. And Ukraine's about the size of Texas, whereas Russia spans, oh my God, what is it, like 11 time zones? I mean, it's nearly halfway around the world, for crying out loud. So it really wasn't an equal fight at all. And the Ukrainians have done a fantastic job. They have fought the Russian Air Force to a draw. Neither side has air superiority. Russia grabbed 20% of Ukraine, and Ukraine has now fought back and reconquered over half of what Russia grabbed in February. So I think they have done a great job with what we have given them. Right now, it's a stalemate. Russia is reconstituting its armed forces. I look for them to make some kind of mass attack within the next probably 90 days. The reason for that is they need to attack before all of the armor that's currently pledged to Ukraine from Germany and the U.S. and Poland and so on arrives. Once that armor arrives and the Ukrainians are kitted out and can field those armor brigades with M1s and Leopards and Bradleys, they're going to go in and they're going to stomp some, you know what, and frankly can drive straight through Zaporizhia to the Sea of Azov and break the Russian supply lines. And the Russians are in deep trouble. So they're going to have to attack now before the Ukrainians are fully kitted out.
So NATO is a big question in this too. I mean, so if the Russians take Ukraine, you know, you've got Slovakia and Poland, which are right there, which are members of NATO. Estonia, Latvia are already members of NATO, which are both on the border of Russia and Belarus, which is essentially Russian controlled at this point, or at least crazy Russian sympathizer in Belarus. For Lord knows I'm not a foreign policy expert, but as I understand it, how bad could this get with the potential of intrusion into NATO?
Well, if NATO were to be attacked, Putin's fully aware, and his generals are fully aware that that's a red line, just an absolute red line. The Article 5 of the NATO Treaty says that an attack on one is an attack on all. So whether it would be, which is why Finland and Sweden wanted NATO now. So an attack on Lithuania or Estonia or Latvia would trigger Article 5, and certainly an attack on Poland. So I really don't see Russia doing that. I think if the Russian generals were ordered to attack a NATO country, they'd probably depose Putin before they'd execute those orders. You know, we have seen Russia's economy is about the size of Spain's. So it is not a major economic power, and it's questionable how long it can sustain this kind of war effort. And even with their massive outnumbering of Ukraine, they haven't been able to crush Ukraine. So why in the world would they even want to think about attacking NATO? That just to me would be off the radar.
Former Congressman Bill Enyart, former Adjutant General of the National Guard. Pitch your podcast real quick. Pitch your podcast real quick.
Oh, my podcast is Reflections from the River. It's on Spotify, Apple, and all the other major podcast providers. You can also get to it from my website, which is www.BillEnyart, BillEnyart.com.
Congressman, we really appreciate the time. Thanks for chatting with us. Hopefully we can do it again soon.
Great to be with you, Patrick.
Rise to politics now, and maybe a little bit more of some insight on why Republicans in Illinois got beaten so badly in November. Our guest is Collin Corbett. He runs a suburban political consulting firm called Core Strategies. Collin's been doing quite a bit of work on the ground, some studies, polling, etc., to maybe find the real reasons why Republicans had such a hard time in November. Disclosure, Collin and I are friends. We've done some campaign work together. His firm he's associated with does our polling, et cetera, et cetera. Take it for what it's worth. Collin, first of all, what prompted you to, instead of just go along with the regular narrative, which we'll get to some of the narrative, what prompted you to say, all right, let's get some real numbers behind this?
Yeah, I think you kind of hit on it. We all have our preconceived notions. We all have our ideas, and they're all driven by our own bias, which is normal. We're human. But we needed actual data. We all agree that significant change is needed in the Republican Party, especially in the state of Illinois, if we're ever going to win. We've been losing for too dang long. And if you're going to make those kinds of transformational changes, it can't be on a whim or on somebody's opinion. You need actual data. And so we went out and got it. We spent, 3 months gathering this data, way too much money, more than I'm willing to admit, to get this information so that all of us could look at it and make fact-based, data-based decisions on, okay, what's happening and what do we need to do better?
Preconceived notions, more than anything, people will say Republicans lost in November because they scared away moderate suburban women. Is that right? Is that wrong?
Yeah, honestly, coming into this, I just assumed that as well. And in fact, I said it in some public forums, and now I have to go and retract that because it's actually not true. One of the parts of our data was a process was looking at turnout, who specifically showed up. And for those who don't know, you'd wonder, why the heck are we talking about this 3 months later? The data takes that long to come out. As a matter of fact, most counties still haven't released it. So we had to find a sampling of counties throughout the state, and even that was a hassle. And so we're just getting access to this data. And so when we look at the data, when we see what happened, turnout was down across the board. 5 points across the board, turnout was down, which is shocking. But it was down way more amongst women than it was amongst males. So much so that males actually made up 2% more of the vote share this election than they had in the past. Female turnout was especially down in Chicago, in Cook County, a little less in the suburbs, but still down in the suburbs. We all assumed this was female turnout. I know the Speaker of the House in Illinois said it was young females that drove this election. It's actually not true. Females, for whatever reason, did not show up in this election, which is shocking when you consider the fact that Republicans didn't win. When you look at this electorate and you see that female turnout was down, when you see that minority turnout was significantly down, Black turnout was historically low, Hispanic turnout was pretty low, Asian turnout was actually not too bad, just down a little bit. This was a very white electorate. This was a very male electorate. This was a very moderate and even conservative electorate. Everything on paper says Republicans should have had a wave. There was, at least in the demographics that showed up, there was actually a red wave, but those voters who showed up didn't vote Republican.
So then what was it? If you look at the downstate numbers, downstate's one of the few places where turnout was actually up. And that should have benefited your Darren Baileys, your Kathy Salvies, your Republican statewide constitutionals who all got creamed. Is it just a simple matter of demographics that Republicans have lost the suburbs and no matter what, downstate can't close that gap?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, politics is math, or elections are math, right? It's a certain number of votes. We saw one of the things we were able to do, and only nerds like you and me will ever appreciate this, but in part two,
I resemble that remark, dude.
We were actually able to quantify with actual numbers what each thing would gain or lose a candidate. I mean, it was, to be honest, it was groundbreaking. I don't think people more than you and me will ever appreciate it. And so what we saw was the Darren Baileys of the world actually did pick up in the electorate around 2 points in the election for being that sort of that purist, more conservative candidate. And you hear this from some of our conservative candidates that say they will drive increased turnout amongst conservatives. It's true. Bailey gained about 2 points, Salvi more like 1 to 1.5. I know our nominee for Attorney General gained 2 points. There is a bump for conservative candidates with increased turnout amongst the base. The challenge is it's always a math problem. What you gain on one side, you might lose on another. And what we saw was in the suburbs, not just because of Bailey, because of Trump, Rauner, January 6th. There's a lot of factors, but demographics that showed up, specifically white males that showed up that always vote Republican, didn't this time. And we saw it anecdotally. We run a lot of campaigns. So when you take the data, you then work that into your experience. And a lot of our candidates saw this, where you see males that typically would vote Republican with Democrat signs in their yards. Trump learned this 2 years ago. He actually did okay amongst minorities. He did okay amongst women. It was males that abandoned Trump 2 years ago in his reelection campaign. We're seeing this now as a trend where actually whites, and specifically white suburban males, are starting to vote against Republicans when they for a long time, we just assumed we had that vote in the bag.
DuPage County is a great example of that, isn't it? I mean, it's a long time white Republican stronghold, and Darren Bailey, for example, lost it by 50,000 votes. So why are those traditionally Republican, even if they're swing voters, they often go to Republican in an off year like this? Why did they switch to Democrat or stay home?
Yeah, what we saw was that was in part one, where we did a exit survey of voters, and we asked them, what drove your votes? And it was yet another situation where you'd think it portends well for Republicans. It wasn't abortion as the number one driver for votes. It was threats to democracy. And that, of course, points to Trump. That points to January 6th. You saw crime play well. You saw the economy play well. And I think it's a number of factors. This is never one thing. Politics is never that simple, unfortunately. And when we see in this election, you see that Republicans spent a lot of time talking about issues that didn't play well to suburban voters. We talked about crime, which was good, but crime was never the issue. It was the economy. Crime's that emotional issue. It gets your attention, just like for Democrats. Abortion is their emotional issue. It gets attention. But then you got to drive that to the issue they care about. Democrats did that well. They drove it to threats to democracy. We just stayed on crime. We didn't push it then to the economy. We didn't push it to that we're leaders, that we're people who can be trusted to lead. And every step in this process, that's what we saw. Voters in Illinois, voters in other states, it didn't matter moderate, conservative, liberal. It didn't matter even Republican or Democrat. They wanted leaders who would step up and be the adults in the room and lead. And we used to be the party of that. That's what our party was known for, that when things are going poorly, when there's national security issues, when there's economic issues, you run to Republicans because they lead well. And we've lost that. We've become more focused on firebrand and Instagram and Facebook and being right more than actually being the leaders in the room. And I think voters are starting to penalize us for that. That when you trust, you want someone who you can trust with the reins of government. And a lot of our candidates in our party have sort of gone away from that.
There's a gigantic divide inside the Republican Party now. It's been there for a while, but I think it's probably showing itself more than ever in the governance wing and the conservative wing. You used to maybe call it the progressive Edgar wing, but it's even people who are more conservative than Jim Edgar, even on things like abortion, that want to govern more than just seemingly scream about issues or run as far to the right as possible. There's a lot of difference in this state in the voters between Metropolis and Zion. Yep. How does your party, how does it find a message and find candidates that can appeal through so many different layers, different demographics, different ways voters think, that don't just get them knocked off the ballot or knocked out of the voters' minds so quickly, essentially like Darren Bailey did, who was a non-starter for so many independents. How do you find candidates? What kind of messaging works that gives you all a chance to win in a general election?
Yeah, you know what I'll say is what we found in a lot of this is that we're all a little bit right and we're all a little bit wrong. You know, Jim Edgar is right that we need to go back to being the governing party, but where he's wrong is by making it a fight between conservatives and moderates. It's not an ideological issue. What we need is a balance of that issue. You know, when you take an average of numbers, I'm a data guy, and when you take an average of numbers, if you have four numbers that you make an average of, and it all equals 3, and they're all 3, that's one note, and it averages out to 3. But if you have 1, 1, 5, 5, that average is also 3. Where we're making a mistake here is that in a state as diverse as Illinois, and in a party that's a bunch of individuals. I mean, we believe in the power of the individual over that collectivism sort of concept. And yet we demand that every candidate look, act, and think and talk like us. We don't need 1,000 Jim Edgars running around. That's just not going to work. We also don't need 1,000 Darren Baileys walking around. We need people who fit their communities. As you said, the voters in Zion or Highland Park or Naperville are different than a voter in Springfield or Decatur or Carbondale or Metropolis. And we need candidates who fit their specific districts. And yes, the average of our party needs to be more mainstream, but that means you're going to have some candidates that are more conservative, some candidates that are more moderate, and we're going to average out as a right of center party. That's what we need. And so as a statewide ticket, we don't need all Darren Baileys, but we also don't need no Darren Baileys. It was proven in the numbers that a candidate that holds firm to those conservative principles does increase turnouts. Think of the power if we could get an and, not an or. If we could have a Darren Bailey and a Jim Edgar, instead of it being this either or situation where we're going to go down that way or that way. This is the most diverse state in the entire country, assuming that one issue profile is the way to go for the entire state just is completely wrong. We do most of our politics in the suburbs, and Lake County is completely different than DuPage County. Yet in a poll, you mesh them together. And those two counties are this close to each other. It's just an extremely diverse state. And so what we need to do is find candidates who fit their specific districts. That means that we stop pushing out the Eastern Bloc members because they do fit their districts. And it also means we stop pushing out the Jim Edgars because they fit their districts in their specific areas. It's the balance or the chorus, if you will, of the many voices that make up our party.
But who wins statewide? But what Republican can win statewide that way? Because I mean, if you look at Bruce Rauner, he was, he snowed over Pat Quinn with money in 2014, but by 2018, he had killed himself downstate. I mean, almost took Rodney Davis and other Republicans with him downstate because he had pissed off so many conservatives, and of course it made himself toxic with suburbanites too. So I don't know that you can even look at Rauner as a success. What Republican can bridge that divide at this point? Can a Republican bridge that divide?
You can if you're a good candidate. This is what we focus on, and now I say we as in my company. Honestly, we're not ideologues. I mean, I have my personal beliefs, and I think I'm right, but so do you, and we probably disagree on some things. Really, if you get a good candidate who can communicate, the voters have shown they'll forgive you if you're a good communicator. We haven't had that. You look in the history of our candidates, we haven't had good candidates in a very long time, especially statewide. I mean, Bruce Rauner was not a great candidate, and we learned was not a good governing leader. And so you have to go back a pretty long ways before you find candidates who were good communicators. People like Peter Roscom, who won in the suburbs because they were good communicators. And it didn't matter that he was very conservative, but he won. He beat Tammy Duckworth in one of the biggest races in the country, despite being extremely conservative. We learned this. Everyone points to Ronald Reagan as being the purist on politics, but actually Reagan learned this lesson the hard way. He lost for president twice in 68 and 72 because he was focused more on that purity test. There's a book called The Strategy of Campaigning where he learned the hard way that we have to build coalitions in order to win. And so it's not about this Washington Post sort of, are you conservative or moderate or liberal? Everyone takes that test, right, to see where they fall on the spectrum. It's not about that. Politics is not 2D like that. We elect people that we like. It's the social media generation. People vote for candidates that they like, even if they disagree with them on some policies. But tell me the last time we ran a likable candidate for office. We just haven't done it in a very long time. And so I'd rather have a candidate who's a good candidate and who fits their district. That's the perfect scenario. But as somebody who has spent an exorbitant amount of time recruiting candidates, I can tell you it's hard to find somebody who checked one of those boxes, let alone two. And so for us right now, our focus is on good candidates. If we can find high quality candidates, they're going to be able to bridge that gap. Darren Bailey didn't lose because he was conservative. I mean this with respect. I like a lot of people who worked on that campaign. Darren Bailey lost because he was a bad candidate, not because he was too conservative. And we skip past that way too often.
Collin Corbett, his firm Core Strategies. You can go to their website. What's your website?
Corestrategies.com. CORstrategies.com.
read a lot of his data there and kind of see your post-mortem on what we saw in November. Collin, thanks so much for the time.
Thanks, Patrick.
All right. Thanks to our friend Collin Corbett for his time and talking through their data. And what they saw is they looked into why Republicans had such a downturn, a turnaround. From what I think a lot of the conventional wisdom showed going into the November election. I think. I had, and it wasn't just Republicans that thought the red wave was going to happen. I had a Democratic legislator text me on election day and say, anyone that thinks this is going to be a good day for Democrats is lying to you. And it turned out to be a pretty good day for Democrats, especially in Illinois. So it's really interesting, and you should go and read some of that data if you can find it at corestrategies.com. And of course, also appreciate Congressman Bill Enyart's time as we were able to talk to kind of the plight of the Southern Illinois Democrat and a little bit of some of his expertise too on some foreign policy and military things as well. So really interesting stuff from them, and I hope you enjoyed it. Drop us a note anytime, mailbag@theillinoise.com. We really appreciate your thoughts, your comments, your notes to us throughout the week, which help us make this show and our newsletter better. Go subscribe to the Illinoise newsletter at theillinoise.com. We put out a free email at least 3 days a week, and you can check that out at theillinoise.com. Just click on the top right of the screen where it says subscribe, and you can put in for the free newsletter, and no cost, no risk on your end to see the stuff that we're putting out. Thanks again for your support, for listening, and we'll talk to you next time here on The Illinoise.